Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, welcome to you all. This is Adnan Husain with Office Hours. This is the fourth edition of our continuing live stream series where you can drop in and have a chat, engage in a good discussion. Sometimes I won't have a guest. And it'll just be me, and you have the opportunity, if you want, to ask me questions, and I might have some comments and commentary to get us started. But today we do have a guest who will be with us shortly. But before getting to bringing my guest on and speaking with him, I first want to say, please like the stream. I know we're just getting started, so it would be helpful for your colleagues, your friends, for other people. If you like the stream and it gets onto their feed, you can also, of course, share the feed on your social media. As I like to say, don't be parsimonious or miserly, with good analysis, which I'm expecting we are going to get. So share it. Bring in more friends, comrades, and so on. And also subscribe to the channel so that it comes on your notifications. And of course, also, you can support this channel and help us out. There are a lot of costs associated with the platform fees and so on. And above all, a lot of the interviews I do are recordings and they have to be edited for video and audio. So anything you can do to help would be greatly appreciated. You can support this project, public educational project, by going to patreon.com/Adnan Husain or making a contribution one time, buy me a coffee/Adnan Husain. But the most important thing is, as I said, like the video, share the stream, subscribe to the channel, tell people about it so we can get more people who are learning and engaging. But I'm especially excited and happy about having live streams because I really love the interaction with all of you in the audience. And I see a number of people are in already contributing to the chat. This is going out on Twitter, X, as well as on YouTube. And but if you're watching on X, I would really encourage you to come to the YouTube stream so that you can engage in the discussion that's taking place in the chat so we can get to your questions, comments, and so forth. So before bringing on my guests, I just want to acknowledge some of the people in the chat. It's wonderful to see new people and returnees. Bruce Malm, Resistance is Fertile. It's great to see you, Benji. Desert Mantis, Alex Bookbinder, VM, Coca Zafreen, Auntie K's Tarot, Chit Matcha. So a lot of returnees. Verena Fraser, it's great to see you. We're really excited to have this discussion. Abram Zevuster, to have this discussion with my guest, and I hope you're going to be posting. I already have some comments and questions from patrons that we'll get to at a certain point, but also I love to see what people are saying in the chat. So post your comments, questions, and we'll try and get to them and integrate them. But without any further ado, I want to bring on my guest, Dr. Max Isle. How are you, Max?
I'm good, Adnan. How are you?
Oh, I'm really well, and it's so great to see you, and I'm very excited for this conversation and to have your thoughts on this important topic. So by way of introduction of the topic and you, I just wanted to say that I had recently an episode on settler colonialism with Dr. Laleh Khalili, who was responding to a really awful book by Adam Kirsch on settler colonialism, which in a way is an index of how important and significant this concept has become, particularly in the pro-Palestine solidarity movement, in building upon, decolonizing politics and strategies, a lot of which have been studied in academic discourse. And that sort of revival of this concept of settler colonialism has been politically salient in both scholarly and activist circles, to the extent that we had like student movements, Gaza encampments, um, and this kind of reactionary response to try and delegitimize the concept of settler colonialism. And so people can go listen to that and they can read her article. But I was very intrigued and interested to bring you on because you also have a critique of this kind of, or at least a kind of critical engagement and contextualization, as well as a critique of this rise of settler colonialism as a kind of concept. The way it's being used currently as opposed to its older sort of history and use. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, and we're characterizing it under sort of the title Understanding Settler Colonialism in the World System, which is something I think you're really encouraging us to do. And if anybody doesn't already know Dr. Max Eyal, let me just say that he is an anti-imperialist scholar and writer, probably known to many of you if you've been watching and reading and listening to him on some other platforms. But he is senior fellow at the University of Ghent's Conflict and Development Department and a researcher associated with the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment. He's written a really important book that we spoke with him about on guerrilla history with my co-host Henry Hakamaki, The People's Green New Deal. And he's author of numerous influential articles, including two related to this topic that we're going to be discussing as the main topic today. I mean, I'm hoping, we might talk about other related topics, but at least we want to focus and begin with a real rigorous engagement with this concept. And those two articles are Logics of Elimination and Settler Colonialism, Decolonization, or National Liberation. That's published in Middle East Critique in 2023. And I encourage everybody to go not only read that, but get to know this journal. It's an absolutely wonderful resource, and it's free and available to people. And the other, more recently, is Settler Colonialism in the Late Neo-Colonial Period, which appeared in Agrarian South, the Journal of Political or Journal of Political Economy in 2024. Also an absolutely wonderful scholarly journal, and people should be reading things that are published there in general, but definitely go read this article. So Max, welcome to you, and thanks so much for coming on. It looks like maybe we're having a little bit of a connection problem. He froze for a minute, but hopefully he'll be. There you are. You're back. Max, welcome. It's great to have you on. Seems like maybe you've got a little bit of a slow internet connection. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I lost you.
Yeah.
One sec.
You're back with us. If you've lost me, that's probably less important than that we can hear you. So,
Hi, can you hear me?
hi. Yes, we can hear you. We can hear
Okay,
you.
sorry. I
Okay.
lost you for a second.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, your connection is a little slow, but I think hopefully, once we can hear you. So that's the main thing. So if you can hear me
Okay.
right now, I just introduced you and welcome to the channel. And I want to ask you, maybe you could start off perhaps by telling people a little bit about what you think is insufficient in some of the ways people have been using this concept of settler colonialism, particularly those who have relied upon the influential kind of paradigm of Patrick Wolf, and the logic, that people focus on the logic of elimination in settler colonialism. What's
Yes.
insufficient in your view?
So I think there's a few aspects that are problematic about how Patrick Wolf came to frame it. I mean, Patrick Wolf basically, in a very what we call a Weberian mode, that is a mode where you pull out specific aspects or processes of a phenomenon, and you turn it into an abstraction that's then called an ideal type, right? And I think although Patrick Wolf originally came from a heterodox Marxist influenced background, and his earliest work, um, uh, Politics and Poetics of an Ethnographic Event, I've settler colonialism, it's the reverse perhaps, about Australia, was very much you could see you can see the Marxist influence on it fairly heavily, but the problem is that the kind of series of processes, the series of events that he derived his idea of settler colonialism were initially the processes of British settler colonialism in what came to be the United States and Australia, and then later expanded to his work on Palestine, and still later he also did work on Brazil, which I'm not particularly familiar with. But what's those specific examples of settler colonialism, those specific phenomena, were drawing basically, first of all, on a very large pool of settlers who expanded through land theft and genocide, and basically sought not to exploit in general the existing population, but to displace them and set up a new set of settler property relationships, right? So, right off the bat, this drove, first of all, Wolf to derive his, he was very stubborn about the way he was deriving, as academics can be, the way he was deriving his material. And he says, settler colonialism is where the dominant impulse, let us say, is not one of exploitation, but one of displacement and replacement, right? Now, the first problem is that that is not how settler colonialism had been historically understood by the national liberation movements. Um, it because settler colonialism was also, the Algerians understood themselves to be suffering under settler colonialism. The Tunisians understood themselves to be suffering under settler colonialism. The South Africans developed a very rich corpus of analysis that was related to, said, we're suffering under settler colonialism. The Zimbabweans likewise said we're suffering under settler colonialism and so forth, right? And other countries as well. Just going to talk about what I know best in terms of case studies. And in these countries, settler colonialism was both displacing from land ownership in part, right? Often in Tunisia, just the most fertile land, similarly to Algeria, the most fertile land, in Zimbabwe and South Africa, the most fertile land. And Wolf, first of all, said those are not settler colonialisms, those are colonies with settlers. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm super blunt. Like, this is just was silly. Like, this can't be taken very seriously as an intellectual maneuver. Like, this was a silly thing he did, and it displaced a concept of settler colonialism. You can find this in the classic. There's this edited collection, settler. It's like edited by Jabor, about settler colonialism in Africa and Asia, and it also kind of removed the applicability of settler colonialism to non-U.S. and Canadian portions of the Americas, and so it reduced the scope of the cases and basically defined away these other cases where the national liberation movements understood themselves to be fighting a joint struggle against settler colonialism. So the Al-Hadaf, the newsletter of the PFLP, understood that its struggle against settler colonialism in Palestine was very much linked to the South African struggle. And there was an association with the Algerians, calling themselves sister struggles, right? And the Red Power movement was, of course, in a conversation with all of these movements, right? And you should have Nick Estes on to talk about that. But what's clear is that there was a braiding, this was a kind of loose heuristic, a general framework of interpretation that helped us kind of give sense to the movement of history, but was above all a theoretical or political framing that was about tying together the national liberation movements, right? So immediately, this was restricted, and the concept was relevantly depolitic. It was removed from its political moorings, its political and organic relationship to the national liberation movements, right? And then redeployed for the purpose, yes, definitely, of offering solidarity uh, uh, to people in Australia. And you can see Wolf referring to the struggles for community control. And of course, to offer solidarity to the people of Palestine. But it was also turned, in many ways, first of all, it was turned into an ideology of defeat. That is, as he explicitly said, settler colonies prove remarkably resistant to decolonization, right?
A
And
regime
again,
change. Yeah.
to regime change, right? Thank you. And of course, like this is just nonsense, right? There were very effective armed national liberation struggles that suffered a great deal, um, and often achieved first political, accompanied with partial economic decolonization, say Algeria, or political decolonization in the case of South Africa or Zimbabwe, that then opened the door to deploy the political sovereignty regime, aka the state, to move in the Zimbabwean case to full economic decolonization, right? Very important, very important. That first challenged the political scaffolding, the political framework that was defending settler property relations in Zimbabwe, and then upended settler property relations entirely using the state, right? Lots of things that are kind of shibboleths, taking state power, using it to restructure it, defending sovereignty, and so forth. Like this became very out of vogue in the Western left. So I think this is really significant in that, in fact, it got turned into this discourse that was not, that was no longer connected to actually political victories, first of all, right? And I think this is a big issue, right? Because actually, of course, Algeria is very contradictory. There's huge contradictions, and there's issues of popularity of the government, of course. But Algeria does not normalize with Israel. Tunisia does not normalize with Israel because they have a sovereign streak that's the fruit of a national liberation struggle, right? They're very sovereigntist states, and this is related to their national liberation struggle. So it's erasing a lot of the necessary political detail, political processes that shape contemporary politics in the service of an abstraction, right? And I'm really being more polite than I would if we were just talking one on one. I'd be much crueler. But I know this is novel for the audience, guys. I'm trying to be chill here. So because it's called office hours, so like I feel like I'm back in an academic setting. So I'm trying to
Well,
behave.
don't feel too constrained, but
Yeah. No, I'll get.
Oh dear. I'm sure he'll come back on. But we're having a little bit of internet trouble with Max's connection. But I think, this is a good point to remind you to like the stream if you haven't already done so. maybe share it on social media. We're just getting going, so if people come across it, they may want to come in and join. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you can attend other live streams and get other videos of my recorded conversations with colleagues. Okay, looks like we have a different connection.
We're upgrading.
You're upgrading. Okay, great. You may need to shut the other kind of window or program down. We were getting
Hello?
we were getting an echo. So
how are we now?
I think that's good, but I think it's because we had maybe it too open. You may want to shut down the other one or at least mute it.
I think it's closed.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, great.
Yeah. Sorry for that.
No, that's okay.
I was having a computer crisis. Okay, so anyway, this is the first thing, is that a lot of the politics, when you carry out this academic and theoretical operation of creating like an ideal type, you begin to strip out history. And we know from Marxism, the concrete is the concrete because it's a condensation of many determinations, right? And these many determinations are being wiped out through this procedure. Speaking abstractly, speaking concretely, we're losing the historical sense of what settler colonialism meant to the national liberation movements themselves, right? And what it still means in a certain sense, right? Second of all, one understands it's clear that the Zionists are very interested in eliminating the Palestinians, right? But in fact, part of associating it with the logic of elimination is, first of all, settler colonialism is not really trying to eliminate the physical presence of, say, the indigenous people of so-called Canada and the United States and Australia anymore, right? It's using other strategies. And there's people there, and there's all sorts of struggles over sovereignty itself in those places. And so, and he acknowledged that. He said there's struggles for community control in Australia, right? And it's also meant starting to wipe out cases. Like, what about New Zealand, which has 15% Maori? There was just a totally different process of transformation there. So again, we're losing specificity, we're losing historical depth, we're also losing really a sense of what the struggle itself looks like by this kind of myopic focus on elimination itself. You look for elimination at the level of historical process, you look for elimination at the level of ideology. And actually contemporary Zionism tends to be analyzed much more in its ideology than its political economy, than its class structure, its relationship with imperialism, and so forth. And this was, people look, they're saying, okay, we're finding these eliminationist statements. It's quite true. This is the practice of the Zionists. But is this telling us what is moving, what allows for the move to elimination, which I'm going to get into, right? This is also excised once we say, okay, it's actually the result of this movement of the congealed settler society itself. So I think this is very significant also. And so it ends up focusing on this kind of evaporating encounter itself and zeroing in on that. And the way, for example, the displacement of the Palestinians hit a lot of borders, hit a lot of hard stops, even within historical Palestine, right? And at any given moment, even though elimination is often guiding the Zionists, especially in the current moment, it's the history of not eliminating that precisely gives you the Palestinians themselves, who are the basis for a resistance movement, right? It's the non-elimination and keeping that in mind, that it is not total, that the struggle is not over the level of ideology that the Palestinians exist. The struggle is not for elimination, the struggle is for national liberation. And that, this is what Rana Barakat pointed out, this should be a lot more of the focus, right? So we kind of collapsed in on this process itself without looking at either the obstacles to the process, right? Or for that matter, what produced the process? Why is it engaging in this process of actually radical displacement of people and, in some cases, but not in others, genocide? What drives that, right? Is it settler will? Well, this is kind of tautology. Of course, you have a will. Someone has a will that's driving them to do a certain thing, but this doesn't tell us where the will comes from or what allows the will to take on the form that it does. So I think this is also very, very central. And this is what's central about the problems of elimination itself. I mean, the problems go well beyond that, of course. So maybe I'll take a breath and let you interject and expand or reframe or what have you.
Well, thank you for identifying some of the clear problems. I mean, your article goes through and identifies several key points, one of which you've been talking about, the work that this idea or concept of the logic of elimination does and what its consequences are politically. And you point out that, of course, this has got big problems in that it doesn't fit all of the circumstances or cases. Somebody, in fact, actually, I believe it was in Antique's Tarot, said, sounds like dividing the settler colonialisms keeps those of us with the most reduced populations, i.e., in, say, Turtle Island, from those with the populations, i.e., still having populations, to believe it's still possible to liberate and end the colony. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about, the political consequences of this division between, settler colonies where there has been, massive displacement, and there's very few of the indigenous people still persisting in and surviving, the process of colonization, and other cases where there was successful resistance in overturning attempts to displace, but maybe a different set of relations, like in Algeria, like in South Africa, like in Zimbabwe. And that part of the consequence of this is to convince people in places like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States that it's pretty much over. There can't be a decolonizing or a liberation. You can't change the settler colonial property relations, right? Because that's not even what's being defined as the key concept. It's the concept of this, logic of elimination. So I'm wondering if you think that Auntie Kay's point is correct. Can you have, and I noticed that there are, like, in this sort of MAGA communists, right? For example, these folks are kind of saying, as we have to just get beyond. We can't have this politics of decolonization, of indigenous resurgence, and so on, because it's kind of over, and we just have to accept the fact of the state as a settler colonial state, and move on and move beyond that, right? So there's something really at stake, it seems, in this division between, even within what we would say is the older kind of concept of settler colonialism as uniting national liberation struggles, to this kind of idea that the logic of elimination creates a certain kind of new politics, because you can't actually have national liberation. I know you talked about that in your article. Maybe you could talk a little bit about
Yeah,
what the politics are. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's two things. I think one, like as the questioner pointed, or the commenter pointed out, right? What is removed is the fact that there have been successful national liberation struggles, right? That have upended the settler political sovereignty and the settler property relationships in turn, right? One leads to the other. I mean, I think, of course, a political colonization is very incomplete in a settler colony without severely reworking the settler property relations themselves as well. Like, that's absolutely critical, because land is the agrarian question, and who has land, who's able to benefit from it, how you're able to carry out economic development. This is reliant on people being able to establish themselves on simply plots of land. You also need plots of land in order to both carry out a process of sovereign accumulation and development, but also to build and also to build up infrastructure and so forth. I mean, there's a very vivid example of just how central sovereignty and sovereign control over land is in what's going on in Palestine, with all the abbreviations, foreshortenings, garrets applied to sovereignty in Gaza, right? In fact, there was some administration of what could go on in that geographical area from 2014 to 2023. There was the ability to use the underground of that area, and that is because the settlers were forced to leave, right? Because it had been deemed impossible to maintain the settlers inside the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinians made use of that space that had been secured. This is so little mentioned because of the embargo on the discussion of resistance itself in the process of discussion of national liberation, decolonization in this discourse, which, I think this discussion of, the Palestinian, given the prevailing liberal politics in the Euro-American core, you build a much wider block of people sympathetic to the Palestinians. It's objectively true by presenting Palestinians as suffering victims. But Palestinians are not just suffering victims. In fact, Palestinians are also a people who are, in fact, the only ones who are really right now, with the help of Yemen, with the help of Iran, but primarily themselves, and with the help of Lebanon, of course, of Hezbollah, are primarily themselves the ones capable of ripping into the war machine that is killing them, right? That is the Palestinians doing that. That's not someone else doing that. And, so of course, once, it's undeniable that it's beneficial to have a wide block of support and make people horrified and not accept what's going on. But it's also undeniable that at the same time, when Palestinians took their own history in hand, October 7th, and crossed over these historical armistice lines that also constituted a prison frontier, the armistice lines between the Gaza Strip and 48 Palestine, right? They took their history in hand and attempted to challenge this power that was ruling over them. What happened was, of course, we know very well what happened, is that most of the radical left, large numbers of people identifying as anti-Zionists, condemned them for it. This was very mainstreamed. And for example, the Adam Schatz and so forth. Yeah. And also other people too, right? It became very mainstream to condemn them. It became very rare to say, okay, there have been very few cases of decolonization in the modern world system that occurred without the application of force against the colonizer. That just hasn't happened, historically speaking, very much, right? And that's important. And so this discussion is not part of what the kind of the liberal, let us say the liberal framework of settler colonialism doesn't allow for the opening up even of this conversation, which we are restricting to the territorial box of historical Palestine right now also. It did not allow for that to even be imagined. And so you saw widespread condemnation of October 7th, or the kind of demonology of these people who, when you could see videos of these people being interviewed, and one of them would be like, well, I am an athletic trainer, and I work at a gym. But I had to join this because these Israelis deny me the capacity to have a future for me and my children. Right? Okay. Like, so why there was an urge to turn these people into demons. And before that, any engagement was already walled off by this framing of elimination of settler colonialism as a process of elimination that is essentially an exercise in victimology, rather than settler colonialism being a historical expression, rather a historical relationship that is part of the history of capitalist imperialism, that is a specific historical relationship within capitalist imperialism, is very specific, is settler colonialism, right? And like every single oppressive, exploitive, and brutal process, it also has a process of resistance to it that constitutes history. And so that was disbarred from visibility, right? And you also see this in the literature itself. There's 2 studies on Islamic Jihad. There's a lot on Hamas. There's one on the PFLP. There are some on Hezbollah. There's almost nothing on there's almost nothing on Ansar Allah, right? These things can be studied, right? But they aren't. And there's a diversion. It's also part of a disinterest or a fear of engaging with these forces in the Arab-Iranian region. And again, it's not that this is, some of portions of that, of course, flow logically from the focus on elimination itself as the main historical phenomenon that we wish to understand in a situation of settler colonialism. Portions of that are in the theory, and portions of it are kind of the partner or tend to be entailed by the theory. And I think this blocks from our understanding, first of all, in general, these processes of resistance itself, but also what I think is really a huge issue is that this process of elimination also encourages people to look in a historical closed box, like a national box, and to think of elimination as linked purely to settler will. And this is wild, actually. I'll talk about the case I know best. I mean, the Israelis, right? First of all, of course, the Israelis are genocidal, right? But they activated genocide in response to Palestinian resistance. Yeah. That's one thing that really, it seems is not part of the discussion. It's like, there's a fear to say this somehow. And it's like, it's very clear that's what happened. Of course, they would like to, but that's when they said, okay, this is our advantageous option. This is when we're going to activate it. First of all, in reaction to Palestinian resistance, but second of all, with a permissive atmosphere in the region and internationally. That is, the US has been moving to wide-scale state collapse, development, murder, genocide, and mass killing across the region itself, right? Starting in 1991, right? This is an overall process. This is a holistic process that US imperialism started to revert to with the fall of the Soviet Union. And it looks a lot like what happened furthermore, under the colonial system itself, under the previous colonial system, under the European empires, and also the process of settler colonial expansion. This was checked by the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and the rise of the national liberation movements is what checked some of this process, I think, right? But with the fall of the Soviet Union, then the fall of Iraq, or its encirclement by sanctions, right? The US starts moving to a process of economic massive exploitation and immiseration, and also mass killing. 500,000 Iraqi children died from 91 to 99 under the sanctions regime. 500,000 Iraqi children, right? That is a massacre. That is a massive massacre that was part and parcel, that first of all could only occur at that scale with the fall of the USSR, but also became kind of the organic, became the overweening mode of accumulation and de-development, to take al-Qadri's term, in the Arab-Iranian region, right? And then we see the hot wars beginning to explode, right? We see 2003, Iraq killing 1 million, 2 million people, right? 2006, okay, the hot war against Lebanon, defeated by resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the fall of Libya in 2011, the 13-year dirty war against Syria, in which 600,000 people died. And of course, this is usually somehow attributed to the Syrian government, which is very ridiculous, right? This cannot be sustained by even the reports of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, funded by Qatar, which is party to the war, okay? And these cannot be sustained, right? So, and then 500,000 people are killed in Yemen with a US war that it outsourced to Saudi Arabia. You think this idea that the US was accepting of Ansar Allah, Ansar Allah's slogan is not pro-US, right? The person says yes. Actually, maybe we can lift that up later, because I would like to say something about that. I don't disagree with the commenter who just commented, but I want to get back to that, because I think it's a legitimate comment and it deserves a discussion about how I see it, and it's fair though. But yeah, so this what's happening in Gaza is part and parcel of the overall U.S. project of depopulation. I didn't mention, for example, Egypt, which post 1991 with the neoliberal reforms, rural poverty became basically absolute. That is, everybody in the countryside became extremely deprived, and so you see a massive destruction of the life possibilities of people in rural and accordingly urban Egypt, right? And to a lesser extent, Tunisia is able to maintain its state structure and so forth, but in fact, people can't carry out social reproduction in post-uprising Tunisia. In fact, you have 2 million Tunisians living abroad, right? They have been displaced by economics, right? That is, Tunisia as a social formation doesn't reproduce itself in any way, shape, or form internally. It requires these external resources. It can't provide for jobs for the population domestically and so forth, right? So what I mean to say is that this type of, and others can talk much more about the war making in the Great Lakes region, what happened in Afghanistan. This is also consistent with the Patnaik's point that you saw a worldwide in Indonesia and especially South Asia, you saw secular decline in food grain consumption amongst popular classes. That is, what you saw is a worldwide process of a war on the poor, right? And it took a very extreme form, not both economic and kinetic or military and sanctions based in the Arab-Iranian region. And Gaza is part of that, right? Gaza is not separate from that in the first place in terms of US policy. But then once we look beyond the territorial box, and this is what is critical, and this is what is not discussed, it is not allowed to be discussed in Middle East studies academia, is that although it can be discussed, for example, in the Israeli National INSS, the Israeli National Security Studies Institute, and you can discuss it at West Point, but you can't discuss it in Middle East academia, is that it's very clear that the forces that the US does not like are sharing weapons. They share logistics with one another. That is why there was a war on Syria, is because it had arms factories until 2024 for Hezbollah on its own territory. It was a missile and munitions transshipment point. People, the Al-Nukhba from Hamas trained in Syria, right? People could meet safely until 2011, at least, in Syria. Palestinians, Syrians, Lebanese, Iranians could meet safely in Syria until that point. That is, this war was regional, and the process of resistance to it has been regional. Iran shares blueprints for technology or offers physical technology itself to these various social forces. And again, if settler colonialism again in the classic literature is the interplay of the process of capitalist expansion and its political history, which is settler colonialism, with a distinct aspect, namely the contest is over land, basically, right? That's settler colonialism. And then it produces national resistance, and the national resistance forces themselves are the ones theorizing settler colonialism, right? Whether it's intellectuals or whether it's the movements or whether it's really both, and whatever the interplay is between them, the organic intelligentsia and so forth. This is this kind of interplay, which includes, of course, some people would be focusing, okay, here's how settler capitalism is ripping us apart. Someone else is doing research on what the shape and strategy of resistance to it looks like. That isn't operative anymore. It's not allowed to discuss it. And if you do discuss it, you're not part of the discussion, right? And you will be blacklisted, right? So again, it's an intentional process of ideological engineering. This is not like, I'm not pinning this on Wolf, but this is, of course, all part of, a lot of this is either implicit, some of it is explicit in Wolf, but also I think the focusing on the national box when we're thinking about settler colonialism is extremely destructive to our understanding of the world. I mean, South Africa, right, faced defeat because its armies and its associated mercenaries were being defeated across all the rest of Southern Africa. And there was a process of military encirclement. And this was one of the things that caused a crisis of the apartheid regime. And those armies, who fought alongside them? Black troops from Cuba, right? Yeah. So this was an international process of resistance. It's not new. These were Black troops from Cuba who were fighting alongside in Angola, right? And this helped inspire people in Soweto itself. This is what's argued anyway by some. But they also indirectly, they kind of closed the military frontier for South African sub-imperialism, right? And this was widely recognized in the literature at the time. And this was part of, so they thought about settler colonialism, but it was it was like a scaffolding, or it was like, to use the other term, it was like a loose heuristic. It was kind of okay, you had your frame, right? It was kind of skeletal. And then you put different things on it. And it helps because it's a frame, it's structuring how things are moving, because that's what frames do. And it's also putting certain squares from a different perspective, a picture frame. It's definitely helping how we see certain objects. So this was all understood. It was all helpful, but it was loose. It was not this tightly bounded thing that was occurring in a national box with a specific outcome. This was not the purpose of it. And I think we've lost a lot. Now, other people might say we've gained from the ability to reach out. And, Abdul Jawad Omar has a very sharp critique of this. He says, okay, like not only this, but also the comparison with the Holocaust itself. Again, this might be rightfully provoke outrage. It might be a reclamation of the term from the Zionists, but at the same time, it is a discourse of a victim, right? And this is a weak basis for solidarity, which is not joint victimhood. It's a joint struggle, right? That's what solidarity is. And, it's not a coincidence that the US state, right, is moving also on that contradiction itself, right? They just, Tom Cotton, I believe, I always forget, our sovereign representatives in the US Senate, just said, okay, the Palestinian youth movement is linked to one of the so-called, is linked to some of the so-called terrorist factions, and this is why we're going to ban them. Okay, or we're going to look into their nonprofit funding, for example, right? Okay, well, this is that they're exploiting attention itself that is part and parcel of this kind of separation of Palestine movement work from an understanding that there are Palestinian factions that represent the Palestinian people imperfectly, but substantively. And yes, the US is criminalizing those Palestinian factions, but that is the framework for Palestinian political work. And if we interiorize, there's part implicit, I think, in the settler colonial framework that is now in common currency. If we interiorize that separation, then we also create weak points for the US government itself. It's saying, okay, well, you guys are not just a movement of sympathy, you're a movement that supposedly has these links with these factions. And it's saying, okay, to all the people who dislike those factions, it's kind of throwing down the gauntlet into the Palestine supporters. Like, okay, well, how dare you can't have a broad-based civil society support for the Palestine movement if it's linked to these factions, right? So, this is all, this is the world as it is. This is the ideological, cultural, political landscape. Like, we have to deal with it. We have to maneuver on it. But, this theory, which was helpful in identifying the process of Zionist alienation of land from the Palestinian people, right? It did do a great job in doing that, but much was abandoned in its codification of a very narrow set of political processes. It's spurning a large set of other related political processes, and I think we have to account for that, right? This is something serious that happened to our understanding of the world.
Yes. I mean, I think we have a lot. Maybe we could talk further about the larger system. And I really appreciate very much your approach of trying to reorient some of this discussion out of the just national box to look at the regional sort of context and the links. You had a lot to say in both these articles about a kind of sense of strategic depth, that can't be ignored. And you were talking about exactly the kinds of conditions that allowed, the resistance factions in Gaza, after forcing settlers out, to then be able to develop the kind of system of resources, techniques, infrastructure, and so on. And all of that has arisen through these kind of links with broader networks of resistance. But I think it's also very important that you point out in these articles and in your remarks now about how different the kind of theorizing was, that loose frame of settler colonialism and the internationalist kind of component, or at least the broader sort of systemic analysis, as opposed to just the narrow nationalist one. And I've noticed that, when it comes to solidarity with the resistance, there's a really big difference between those who are willing to express solidarity for the Palestinians as victims, and you're pointing out, and perhaps to allow for the sense of the right to resist within the context of the national frame of Palestine's struggle against Zionist, the Zionist state, but feel very uncomfortable broadening that out to include resistance from nation states, like, every time like there's a kind of attack on Iran or something, it really seems to throw a lot of the Palestine solidarity movement into some kind of disarray, or because they feel like they can't, ally themselves fully with the entire, axis of resistance. And this seems to be a big problem. You yourself pointed out that the fall of settler colonialism in Southern Africa had so much to do with the regional resistance that put pressure on South Africa's kind of expansionist and interventionist armies around in Southern Africa. And so we had a question that I thought was from Samuel, who's a patron, that I think is worth kind of thinking about in here, and comparing these eras and what the actual material and political conditions are that are different, that are preventing in some ways the kinds of solidarities and active resistance that we witnessed being successful in overturning settler colonialism historically in the past. And so Samuel says, I have a practical question. I think this is in a way a question that a lot of people are thinking about right now. I have a practical question related to anti-imperialist struggles. We are witnessing an industrial scale slaughter of an entire population in Gaza, and the best resistance sans those brave Palestinian resistance fighters have mustered to mount is to appeal to liberal humanitarian principles and institutions which are, for all intents and purposes, dead. Can we dare dream of a possibility of international resistance akin to, say, international brigades aiding the real resistance in Gaza? Also, do you foresee any of the emerging powers, particularly China, take themselves seriously and spearhead a global South version of responsibility to protect and initiate some sort of military intervention to stop the genocidal Zionist state? So what he's really asking for is like, well, I mean, I put it to you, and what do you think about this kind of question, and what the can, this is a wish, I think, in some ways, that at least people who are on the pro-resistance sort of analysis of settler colonialism and who recognize the value of the internationalist sort of frame, but are not seeing, kind of material conditions allow or seem to militate to actual kind of intervention outside of a few key, members of this kind of resistance movement, principally in the region.
Well, first of all, that's not. I'm in sympathy with the comrade's question, but we cannot forget about Pala action, especially in the United Kingdom, right? Which, first of all, has mass support in the UK, massive popular support. I don't know if it's widely known that London Palestine rallies have 1 million people at them.
In 2003-4, I happened to be living in the UK in London, and every 2 weeks there would be a national rally where there would be at least 500,000 people, and at certain points, as you're saying, 1 million. It would be hours and hours, and you're absolutely right, like 800 people, most of them, it seems, pensioners, like elderly, elderly white people who you would imagine is like your typical kind of Tory voter in your mind, are in solidarity with Palestine Action being arrested under this,
under the draconian, the draconian anti-terror listing. And there's a chance that there's a substantial chance, I would say, that this listing can get reversed, right? Yes. Which is inseparable from the mass popular support for Palestine itself, and the fact that they can get 1 million people to rally. So, I think there's campaigns to be plugged into. There's the anti-Maersk campaign. There are concrete campaigns to disrupt the logistics of oppression that are delivering the weapons to carry out the genocide in the EU and the US. Those aren't strong enough because, let's be honest, when this genocide began and as it's continued, there was not a sufficient level of organization, right? And I'm in organizations. I'm not going to discuss them right now, but like they're all legal. But I'm just not going to discuss them. But it's hard. Even people with all of these right politics, I think a lot of people are not in organizations and actually get frustrated with organizations. But if our organizations have been much stronger in October 7, 2023, I don't want to say that the situation would be different, but it's possible it would be different with much stronger organizations. We were not strong enough to do what was necessary. Because you would need much stronger organizations to offer a popular credo of support for Palestine Action lookalike in the US, where property is the most sacred thing in the world. Mm-hmm. Right? You just need it. It's objective. Like people are like, why this why don't we have a Palestine Action US and there is one UK? Well, there was briefly, but bracketing that, like, why isn't there a widespread movement? Okay, because the US is a lunatic state. Therefore, you need a much stronger popular credo for it if you want to deal with that lunacy. So again, we have to we have to organize. Like, and I always bring up the example of Yemen. Like the Yemenis, the Ansar Allah emerged from like a cultural revival movement in the late 1990s. Then we're like fighting vicious inch by inch wars against the US neo-colonial backed Yemeni state from 2000 to 2011, and then marched into the capital, and then fought a vicious war against the US and Saudi Arabia for 6 years, right? Till the Gulf sued for peace, basically. And then they were in a position to carry out support operations for Palestine. So it took them 20 years, right? And that has to be kept in mind, that you have to now, in terms of the global South doing some form of short-term internationalist intervention, I don't think it's very likely to happen. What I think is plausible is that with sufficient organization and pressure, you could see, for example, more global South participation in cutting off maritime supply lines. And we see it already, right? I don't want to, Turkey announced it, but please, Turkey has announced this 1,400 times that they're stopping transmissions of weapons or fuel or whatever to Israel. Like, I'll believe it when like someone reports it that's trustworthy and that like reports that there's no more boats.
When the effects are seen of action.
When the effects are seen. But until then, I cannot take it seriously, right? But yes, you can. This is a move that is possible, I think, with more organization. And until then, the Palestinians are going to keep grinding down the Israeli occupation army. And that's the situation, right? And I don't say this to be like, well, we can't do anything. The problem is, like, to do something, you have to get organized. And like, there's this, and in organizations I've been in, people are like, well, we're not doing anything. Fuck this liberal shit.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, I feel you. I understand where you're coming from, but you actually need like a mass organization to get something done. Right. You do. And this is something that is really missing. I mean, I wanted to jump to that comment I saw about the person who pointed out that it could seem to play into the Zionist narrative. And
right. So that was from Benji from Resistance is Fertile. If I can find it, I will. And I think one thing that might be sort of related to it, of course, also is Joe's question here about the protests within Israel. And so
I mean, I don't view the Turkish announcements as cynically as I view the protests in Israel. But if the Israelis want to protest, why don't they go to the armistice line with exactly. Gaza and go to so-called Kerem Shalom and like open that and let the aid trucks through? Right?
Exactly. Yes.
Those 250,000 people are protesting. Probably half of them are in the Army Reserves.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not efficacious. I hope they would do something, but I'm not like sitting here holding my breath until that happens. The question was really like, it seems to play into the Zionist narrative when you point out that the genocide was incited by October 7th.
Right.
And first of all, like, it may, but the genocides of communists in the Koreas were incited by communist organizing, weren't they? Right? I think it's true, right? So it doesn't blame them because people have the right to do it, and then it incites a reaction from people who do not accept that the world system and its political scaffolding and the political systems that maintain capitalist accumulation are challenged. But the murder of 4 million people in Vietnam was because the Vietnamese carried out a national liberation movement, was it not? Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, these were not just killed because the French are racist colonizer primitives, right? Like that's not what happened. It happened because the Vietnamese got organized into a communist national liberation movement that laid waste to the French and then laid waste to the US Army. And the US Army did not accept their loss. And so they applied ever more mechanical force and killed millions of people. This is not blaming the Vietnamese, right?
Right. Well, as Malcolm X said, you remember Dien Bien Phu. I mean, that's what happened. And then it led to, unleashing
Right.
of genocidal violence. But it happened because the resistance couldn't be defeated and suppressed without doing that. Right.
Exactly. And so, again, we want to bring it back a little bit, to our topics. I mean, a lot of this has been foreclosed by what looks like a structural analysis that has surface affinities with kind of a materialist approach to history, and therefore it has an appeal on that level. And I think it's been kind of I think a lot of people with the politics of the people listening, I suppose, have found that appealing at certain junctures of their life, or in our collective political development. But I think it's leaving so much out of view that we need to move beyond it in certain ways, right? It blocks from view critical solidarities. It really does. It blocks from view critical dynamics of the historical process. It blocks from view capitalism, really. It actually makes capitalism subservient to the process, kind of in a logical sense, subservient to the process of colonialism, whereas colonialism is literally the political history of capitalism. That's what it is, right? It doesn't make it less important. Like politics is our lives. So it's very central, but we need to be able to weave these connections because this helps us understand the world we're in.
Absolutely. Yes. That your remarks before also do remind me that in terms of organization, your point also, it seems to be, is that, we also have to clarify and understand these historical processes in clarifying actually what is the problem. Because if the problem is just, some kind of vague sense of the will of the settlers, or that doesn't have is amorphous and unexplanatory of any of the conditions, and also doesn't lead necessarily to clear and decisive political action in resistance to it. I mean, what is the cure for people who have like a destructive will against like people who are different from themselves or others because of some racial hatred? I mean, as you pointed out, maybe a little facetiously, I don't know, in the argument, is that a lot of this tends to authorizing, liberal multiculturalist politics and, kind of.
Well, no, I wasn't. I was. I think I was paraphrasing Wolf, to be honest. I mean, I think he says this towards the end of one of his pieces. I mean, this is actually what he advocates for in the case of Palestine, where I think I think things got very confusing in the sense that I think he said a just outcome would be a kind of liberal democratic state with the workaday inequities of capitalism. Edward Said would approve,
Right.
And like whatever, maybe, but like, how do you get there, right? You're talking about an end, and it was common at that point to talk about ends without talking about means. How do you get there? right? It's fine to talk about ends, but what's important is to say what is the plausible path, right? In fact, something else that Wolf said, what I think was very problematic, is that the Palestinians endure because without the Palestinians, difference itself would become Jewish. And what he meant by that, I think at some level, was that without Palestinians, there would be difference within the Jewish Zionist bloc along ethnic and class lines. But this is not why the Palestinian population was not eliminated from historical Palestine. Like, this is a crazy functionalist explanation that we're seeing dismantled in real time. Now, it's not. We all get things wrong in forward-facing scholarly engagement, obviously. And if you're aiming for infallibility, like, you're not going to say anything, or you're going to say very little. Like, this is silly. Like, we're engaged with the world. We're going to fuck up. But I think it's indicative. He lost the ability to really even think about it, which was too bad, because he understood that Australia itself had this history of struggles for community control, and I think the Panther movement in Australia and so forth. He understood that there was this history, but he couldn't connect it, and he wasn't pushed to connect it, even with it in the Palestinian case. And I think it's that tendency is, of course, broader. This is, I think this mode of analysis has run its course, essentially. There's a lot of, it was common, to be talking about, in this loose heuristic way, about settler colonialism also, like, the dependency theorists, they talked about it too, right? I mean, Samir Amin talked about it, and, as I was discussing, the South African theorists of capitalism, they talked about it all the time. There were currents of this type of thinking for, actually, coincidentally, totally, because we never barely even talked about it. My PhD supervisor, Phil McMichael, wrote about this in the case of Australia. And of course, this work very much existed in the Palestine case. You have, in the situation of Palestine, you have Nahla Abdul, who used this framework in a modification of this framework to talk about colonial settler capitalism and its gendered effects in Palestine, in Mandate Palestine. We need to go back to these traditions and build them. And there's a lot they were probably missing too, that we've learned to see better in terms of gender contradictions. And how patriarchy is structuring the imperialist contradiction and labor reserves and so forth. I mean, there's a lot more to build. It's not like we want to take these as static texts from the past, like Holy Writ, that's passed down to us, and we regurgitate it. This is not the point at all. But I think there were fundamental methodological points about understanding that colonialism was the political history of capitalism, right? And this is that's the basic point. Okay, so we have to understand how that all works. And that's what we need to do, and to also structure the conditions under which resistance occurs, which is ongoing in the so-called United States. Of course, Canada. I mean, the reason people know about, one of the reasons the discussion about settler colonialism got so in vogue, right, was because of the resistance, actually, because of what happened both at Standing Rock and Idle No More in Canada, right? That's actually what widened, I think, people's awareness of these issues and gave an initial thrust to these revival of these frameworks in many ways, right? So we keep it in mind that the resistance is actually enabling us to see things that we didn't see by making visible oppressions that were either naturalized or, more relevantly in the cases I'm discussing, not enough people could see to make them more mainstream. And then they're incorporated into land acknowledgements, right?
Yes.
That is, people see them but understand them as something you acknowledge, as opposed to something that to go back to the kind of leitmotif that are resisted.
Right, that you do something about them. Yes, that's right. Just as a little footnote to the previous discussion about organizing resistance, I mean, and you were mentioning the maritime blockades. I mean, there's a large Sumud flotilla being organized with up to 60 ships, and I heard Laith Maruf on somebody's show saying, why aren't they doing something, like instead of repeating what they're going to do, which of course the scale of it is larger. Maybe they think it'll work. Maybe it'll be different as a result of like a more overwhelming group of ships trying to break the blockade and get to Gaza and so forth. But he was asking, well, why don't they, maybe have a kind of peaceful landing on the beach of Cyprus at Akrotiri and take over, the base, or force the British military and with popular forces in Cyprus to actually reclaim sovereignty of their own land. Maybe something could be done there, or have a blockade that actually, does something in the Straits of Gibraltar, or maybe acts as a blockade like Ansarullah is doing in Bab el-Mandab. Of course, these are kind of inchoate sort of suggestions, but I think the point is that people are trying to think that what we've done, while it has had some effects, and has elicited response, and obviously that's one of the indices that maybe it's worth continuing to do these things, just like Palestine action has elicited a major response from the British from the British state, but also why don't we try some different things? So
I mean, Light is in Lebanon and dealing with a lot of shit, so I respect what he's doing, but people who want to do things need to go organize and do them, and I'm not going to tell anybody to do anything at all. God bless you and figure out what you need to do, but I'm not going to agitate you to go do something. I'm not doing it right now. I'm writing stuff. I'm not going to tell you to go do it. I in good conscience, that's not. I don't ever feel comfortable doing that.
Fair enough.
And anything you're going to do, don't talk about it with me. Get out of here. Don't, because go figure out, go do it, and go do it and write notes to yourself on paper about it, sorry, 1 second. 1 second, please.
We have another question that I'll be bringing up in just a second from that were posted before earlier on that might help us widen the discussion and also connect it to some other sorts of movements. So yeah, I wanted to switch over to another kind of question that had come in earlier. Ricky had asked, I would love to hear Max talk about the ideas he presented in his book, A People's Green New Deal, through this lens of settler colonialism, and to hear more on the importance of both what he's saying, deindustrialization and decolonization as the only means for survival of our species on this planet. So I wonder what you think about that, how you would connect that larger analysis about the world system, which is, I think, where this is gesturing to.
So yeah, I guess we got a little caught in the box, and that was not the intention of this. So, but I think it's a great question. I mean, I would say two things, right? First, I think there is a way, very unfortunately, that this kind of discussion of nature and the indigenous is often taken in a very unfortunate direction. But in fact, I think there's super interesting things that can come from it if we reorient ourselves a little bit and don't have this kind of idea of the indigenous and a garden of Eden and so forth, whatever. Which is that the biodiversity hotspots are in the world system, are in indigenous managed land, right? Basically. And indigenous managed land has a much higher qualitative level of biodiversity, rare species, and so forth. And this is very much related in the first place to, first of all, this really shatters this idea that is very common in a lot of eco-modernist thought, but also leftist ecological thought, that human and non-human nature are in this deep antagonism, right? In fact, what is non-human nature is historically co-created by humans, right? This is something very interesting that we know from both indigenous and non-indigenous historical geographers, for example, of the Americas, who have done amazing work showing that this was a managed landscape. The whole Americas, this is actually, I talk about the Americas, which is what I know best. This was an intensely managed landscape that actually sustained very complex civilizations, that they're always increasing the number of the population estimate. You see it all the time. They're like, we were totally wrong about Brazil. Like, it's many more people were in these complex managed landscapes than we thought there were, right? I think this is very interesting to think about because it breaks down a lot of unfortunate thinking that you see often in various directions, both the idea that you need to kind of build this kind of apartheid between humans and non-human nature because humans are intrinsically engaging in damaging activities in the course of production and reproduction and appropriation of the non-human environment. And also that the indigenous are these kind of like in these kind of prelapsarian relationship with nature. No, they were in historically managed landscapes that were very much engaged with divisions of labor and complex civilizations that were very large demographically speaking. I think that's very interesting. And it tells us the insights of that have really been built on in terms of all forms of work that about convivial conservation. The conservation can go alongside with relatively intensive agricultural land use, the work of Nature's Matrix. I think this is something people need to engage with, and this is the one I forgot about Hawaii. Thank you. And this was very interesting. I mean, Hawaii had, I believe, historically the same population it has today, right? And again, this is actually, these were sophisticated technologies that were just not industrial technologies. And I think this is important to keep in mind in terms of thinking about, this allows us to rethink about what modernity is. What is an appropriate modernity, right? I think, I don't think people are like going back to nature or whatever, but like are going back to this, but aspects of it will be repurposed in the building of a different future. And it also questions the kind of universality of Western technological norms and their universality, right? And this is, you see this in the Chinese processes, for example. It's always been about using what there is and taking what is there and also building new things and taking what you need. So I think all of this is very tied to this question of settler colonialism. You have a dog issue. I think this is the one side of the equation that really I found very interesting and engaging with this literature. The other thing that I found really important is the question of industrialization, that you need to get rid of the physical presence of the settlers in order to have a sovereign industrialization. It's clear, right? And there's very interesting things, again, that no one talks about that have happened in Zimbabwe. Right, very interesting. I mean, in Zimbabwe, they have the biggest steel plant in Southern Africa. There are attempts at value added in the lithium sector. It's written into law. I don't think there's that much value added yet. But this is related to the expulsion of the settlers, the breaking of the settler colonial land property structure, not the expulsion, sorry, but the breaking of the settler capitalist property structure. Right. And then you have the grounds for just moving towards. Zimbabwe is a small sanctioned poor country, but there are efforts to move towards a sovereign industrial model. Right. And that is, again, very important because it actually says, okay, breaking settler colonialism, national liberation, economic development, delinking, sovereign industrialization. These are historical processes that logically you are probably moving in some sort of sequence, probably, because although you can carry out aspects of military industrialization, which is what happened in Gaza, there's a very sharp limit to that under conditions of settler colonial control, right? And this is, again, it moves way beyond this thinking of settler colonialism and stopping elimination, and says, okay, part and parcel of that is actually the process of why are you freeing the land if not for a sovereign development project on popular terms? Why are you freeing the land, right? It's not like you're not decolonizing your consciousness. It's to have a good life for your people, right? And this, again, creates a political linkage, or doesn't create the political linkage. It allows us to see, rather, the political linkage between, say, ZANU-PF, which is remove the settlers from their property relationships, and Palestine. And ZANU-PF is very pro-Palestine. That's the governing party of Zimbabwe. It's a very pro-Palestine party, right? And so this is part of, and I don't think most people involved in Palestine work who would have no problem with what politically occurred in Zimbabwe necessarily know what happened there. I mean, I know about it from my engagement with Agrarian South, right? And I mean, Sam Moyo, rest in peace, 10 years ago, but he did the outstanding work on surveying the results of the Zimbabwean version of land back, right? And yet these contemporary theories of settler colonialism, again, say that this was not even a settler colonial social formation, the former Rhodesia, right? And so again, I think this is why we need to say, okay, we accept that this heuristic, this loose framework, put certain things on the table. That was useful. In the current moment of genocide, we understand the need to broaden the appeal, but we need to deepen our analysis and link it up to the world system and also the future of the world system. That is, what is the role colonial social formations are playing in maintaining the world system, and what are the role of anti-colonial struggles in opening space for a different world system?
Yes, and maybe one other I think that's really important and a very interesting point, and also about the connection between the topic of settler colonialism and this, the kinds of issues you were dealing with in the People's Green New Deal. And this reminds me also that we did have another question that is about another region where we can see potentially, perhaps, where there are struggles to establish sovereignty so that conditions for development can take place. Ricky had a second question, which was he was interested in thoughts on the developments of the AES Confederation in the Sahel and generally how to sustain these revolutionary decolonization efforts through time and against counter-revolutionary attacks.
I haven't. I've been a little overwhelmed in the recent period and haven't been able to keep up with all the recent innovations. But I think there's interesting things going on. For example, the building of, that there's more. Some of the important things that there's now processing tomato paste, tomatoes locally, for example. And people were sort of making fun of this. I'm like, well, this is one of the move to secondary processing and local value added. This is very important in economic development.
And also nobody made fun, in retrospect, with Gandhi and the salt, kind of marches. I mean, there are techniques you have to do, both because they're important materially, but also even just in terms of mobilizing and teaching people the idea of sovereign control over your own resources outside of the colonial economic system. So people shouldn't be poo-pooing these efforts. Yeah,
absolutely. And then it incited it incited kind of kind of trolling campaigns about, well, they're just moving from French to Russian sphere of influence. And, so I decided to open up and look at the terms of the Russian mining operations in the Sahel versus the previous terms. The Russians, with the renegotiation of the share of profit accruing to, I think, Burkina Faso from the mining was an increase of like 15%. Okay, well, that's better. Like, it's great that there's more of the proceeds from the mineral revenue that will circulate in the national economy. If they're under the state, they increase the state budget and so forth. Like, is there another form of economic development people are proposing? Like, right? Like, these are very significant. Right. And of course, Human Rights Watch is engaged in incitement campaigns against, they are finding, of course, every time someone does something that in any state that Human Rights Watch does not like, that the US does not like, Human Rights Watch finds human rights violations. Right. It's like your most reliable way of knowing who the US doesn't like. Who Human Rights Watch is reporting on the most. So I think there's interesting things happening, and it's moving. It's moving very fast, and I have I don't know if they gave me permission to like quote them on this, but I have like economist Pan-African colleagues who are like, yeah, like Traore is by far the most popular leader in Africa.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, there's like AI videos, of him speaking like perfect English. He's like, really, they're legendizing him. And, I think this speaks to that people are appreciative that something is moving. And of course, there's lots of issues with it. But what else could it be? That's what I always say. People are like, what about this? What about that? I'm like, what about being human and human political processes? Do you think they would ever come without a flaw? Like, what are you looking for, please?
Utopia. Apparently, we can only have utopia or capitalism, right? This is like
exactly
the choice.
Exactly.
But I mean, I think one of the other kind of interesting things is it's also not only is there kind of a national sovereign project, of really decolonizing from the neo-colonial, and imperialist order. You might call it like second wave decolonization, sort of happening, but also is sponsoring and fostering kind of more transnational, Pan-African kind of vision for collaboration and solidarity, a real recognition that there has to be some kind of Africa-wide, or at least larger regional sort of, process freeing from particularly, French control, because many of these countries were under, French colonialism and had been collected together in these neo-colonial schemes, to make sure that what was happening in Algeria wasn't going to happen in West Africa and so on. And so, I think it's just a very interesting and hopeful kind of development. I think people would definitely need to pay attention to it. And I just want to plug that on Guerrilla History, we are doing a long-term African revolutions, decolonization and revolutions series. And we definitely plan to have episodes that are engaged with what's happening in West Africa and the resistance there. So I want to encourage people to stay tuned to Guerrilla History, because even though we didn't give, a systematic answer, but at least some basic impressions about the positive developments taking place in the Sahel region and so forth, that there will be opportunities to bring on some people, and many of them African scholars themselves, who will give us a really interesting perspective on what's happening. We've been going an hour and a half, and I don't remember where you are. If this is, it looks like it's you've got sunlight behind you, but I thought perhaps if you were in Europe, this was going to be a late night thing, and I didn't want to tax you for a very late night. But we still have, maybe a little bit of time, to wrap up. And I just wondered if you had any kind of final thoughts really about linking, we didn't talk so much about this sort of second article, because we were starting with really the critique, as it were, of the Wolf sort of thesis and its adoption and limitations for some of the contemporary use of and popularity of settler colonialism as a kind of analytical category in pro-Palestine solidarity today. But in settler colonialism in the late neo-colonial period, I think you took like a kind of broader sort of perspective about how the issue of Palestine fits in the larger world system. And that might be a good way to kind of wrap up the connections between Palestine and the larger sort of kind of place of settler colonialism in the history of, as you're saying, it's sort of the political history of capitalism, and really
Sure.
where we are now. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's become like a fountainhead of global and a polarizing point of global reaction. I mean, it's always been a polarizing point in the Arab-Iranian region, right? Like, it polarized Arab publics. It was one of, where you, if you were the forces that were for national popular development, also in general tended to be more and more pro-Palestine, and conversely, like with the strength of neoliberalism, support for Palestine would decline or be aggressively repressed. And it really had to do with how much the state was having a kind of popular legitimacy, right? And in fact, development itself was conceived as a means to confront Israel, right? The two were never, popular development and Israel were not just like two metrics, but they were actually two intertwined processes. It was understood that you needed national industrialization to confront Israel, which is Yemen and Iran show in spades, right? Now, that polarization is really occurring, I think, on a world scale. I mean, Israel is kind of this fountainhead of reaction, right?
Yeah.
It's an extreme fountainhead of global reaction. I mean, many of the fascist forces, for that matter, anti-Semitic forces in Europe, are extremely pro-Israel, right? It's also become a dividing line in formations like DSA, right? The more electoralist forces that subordinate every social struggle to electoralism also urge that rather than press electeds on Palestine, the movement tails electeds on Palestine, which is another way of saying that anti-Zionism should always be subordinated to conditions of whoever's to the right of an electoral figure, which is another way of saying that actually anti-Zionism is not very important, which is another way of saying you're not very anti-Zionist, in my opinion. This is a veiled way of actually expressing support for Zionism. I see it flatly that way. So it's not, and this goes back to the late 1960s. Palestine polarized the New Left in many ways, right? And it was a split between the white portions of the white and the Black left. The Black left was much more pro-Palestine and anti-Zionist than the white left. And this led also to the fracturing in many ways of the New Left, right? It was one of the elements anyway. And so I think repeatedly we see Palestine and Israel as these kind of polarizing or potentially fracturing elements in global politics. And I think it's, I think Palestine's support for Israel, as I see it at the level of ideology, represents, in the most basic sense, a defense of white property relationships and therefore capitalism on a world scale, right? And it represents a means to carry out a fuite en avant, to like level populations and say, okay, the destruction of Palestine is also, is what's going to happen to you. And this is exactly what Gustavo Petro said.
Yes.
So this is a practice run for what is going to occur to the rest of the population in the face of climate change. And it also is of course, it's being pushed by the Zionists. The Zionists are the spear's edge of U.S. domestic reaction, but there's a but. They're gutting university systems on this basis, or they're putting universities in receivership. Now, this is a both end. The Zionists are the ones pushing that agenda, and capital. This is an agenda that's been long pursued by global capital, is to hollow out what's left of so-called U.S. democracy, right? Like both end it to rip apart student mobilizations. Okay, their administrations are very happy to do that, right? And so it's becoming a mechanism and a pretext, but also pushed directly by the Zionists and their lobbies, who are at the spear's edge of it, of a kind of move towards wide-scale repression in the United States, which is also hitting other people, like we saw with the ICE raids, with the putting of Washington, D.C., and now they're threatening Chicago under military, under the National Guard. We'll see what happens if Mamdani wins, and it's not as coincidence that Palestine became a polarizing element within the Mamdani campaign, right? So I think it's very symbolic for people, on both sides, right? For obvious reasons, like it represents, okay, should people who have nothing and who have a per capita energy use of like zero, and who are living in giant camps, should they have the right to decide the shape and contours and texture of their own future? Or should the militarized, high-tech colonial state built on violence decide how to adjudicate property relations and be allowed to just deal with dissent by genocide and the evaporation of populations? Like, okay, that's the world we live in. Like, people need to decide where they are in relation to that polarization.
Absolutely. That is, I would encourage people who are interested in kind of thinking exactly about the history of that, to check out the 8-part series that I did with Ariel Saltzman, Palestine and the World, History in the Time of Genocide Denial. And we had 2 episodes that really elaborate and are very much in sympathy with that kind of analysis, that it is sort of the dividing line for really thinking about what kind of future humanity and this world will have. And also, I should just, since Yemen came up many times, is just tell people that I did a 2-part series with Dr. Issa Bloomy about Yemen's history that I think is really very relevant today. The day we're having this live stream, of course, there was, massive million, people, at the Friday, the weekly Friday demonstrations, in solidarity with Palestine. And also there was recently, today, drones sent by Ansar Allah. So if you're interested in thinking about, Yemen and why they've been so committed to resisting empire and in solidarity with Palestine, and why they situate themselves on that side of the dividing line that Max was just speaking about, maybe you'll find the 2-part episodes really useful. And lastly, just to point out that we did talk briefly about Palestine Action as an important kind of movement that has had a lot of support in the UK and was briefly, of course, existing in the United States as a kind of solidarity direct action movement before it was sort of quickly shut down. One of the people who was involved in Palestine Action USA and who served some time, a really courageous young activist and anti-imperialist activist and thinker, Calla Walsh, will hopefully be joining me for the next office hour. So in a week, come and talk with her about her experiences. She also recently went to Iran and reported from her experiences there. It's a really interesting person that I think we could learn a lot from. So do tune in again next week for office hours, 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern. We'll keep doing it if you keep coming and posting your questions, raising good comments. And I think, Max, you had hopefully a pretty decent time. There were a lot of good questions and comments, I think, from the audience. And I want to thank you so much for not only the scholarship that you've been doing. Everyone should go check out those 2 articles that I mentioned at the top, and they're linked in the episode notes. And also, you may want to check out other articles that came out related on the Al-Aqsa flood. There's a two-parter there as well that it would be very useful for people to check out. But above all, I want to thank you for coming and spending almost 2 hours with us discussing your work and your analysis. It's been really, really fruitful and interesting, and hopefully for our audience, not only very illuminating, but also encouraging and inspiring. So thank you so much, Max. Really enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you. Thank
And
you so
hopefully we
much.
can have you on again sometime soon to talk about other aspects of your work.
Sure, happy to.
Thanks so much. Okay, everyone. Don't forget to
right.
like the stream before we go. Share it so that people can watch it back. And until next time, peace and solidarity.
All right.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.